I want to start with a question. Can I get a show of hands who here started their career doing something and is now doing something else? Wow. Okay. So a fair majority, and it's not uncommon to see this. And so what I wanted to talk to you today about is about the journey that a lot of people are going through and a lot of organizations are going through when they're thinking about the mobility of talent within their organizations and how we can help individuals as well as organizations think about talent differently. I actually wanted to start with a bit of a personal story. It's a story about my wife, and it's got a sad beginning but a happy ending, I promise. It was about 4 years ago. My wife came home from seeing a doctor, and the doctor said to her that she has a thyroid condition. So it's something called Hashimoto's, which is an underactive thyroid. And the resolution was that basically she had to be on medication for the rest of her life. So it was a difficult time, and we basically spent the rest of that day and that night on our laptops researching what are the other solutions than just medication. Early hours of the morning, my wife finds something called an autoimmune protocol, an AIP diet, which basically says that if you focus on healing your gut, your thyroid will fix itself. So she goes off and she talks to various doctors. Everyone knocks her back because basically you have to have medication, until finally she meets a functional doctor that says basically it's an underdeveloped piece of research and really there's not a lot around it. So my wife, being my wife, her name is Lucy, she decides to go off and study about this AIP diet through nutritional therapy. So two things happen as a result of that. One, she is thankfully in remission, so that's helped address that issue. But the second thing is she decides to have a career change. So she finds that this is a new calling for her. She's a psychologist, I'm a psychologist as well. Not a great combination. This is being filmed, so I have to be careful what I say. But she decides to have a career change and now focuses on health coaching and using some of her skills to be able to help people through this condition. So I share that story because my wife is actually very lucky because she found something through that journey and she was able to leverage some of the skills that she's already got. So through that journey and as we work with lots of organizations, we find that being able to have that path and being able to help people see that future is something that we're really passionate about. And I think the panel mentioned the Business Roundtable. Our CEO, Greg Case, was part of that panel. And so we're also trying to think about the social impact that we have through our work. Can I get another show of hands? Who here has children? Okay, lots of people. Keep your hands up if you've got children in teenage years. I can see some eyes rolling. I'm not going to talk about hormones anymore. So that's interesting because I think everybody that's put up their hands, can I then ask you a question? What do you think is the average age for teenagers this year? What's the expected lifespan? Just shout out some numbers. 95, 85, 78. Okay. So here's an interesting piece of research. The life expectancy for children born in the period in the 2000s, so teenagers now, 50% of kids born in that period are expected to live to be over 100 years old. So if we think about that from an impact of the careers and the journeys that people will have, that actually completely changes the model that we think about traditionally of education for 20 years odd, career for 20 years odd, retirement for 20 years odd. That journey is going to be completely different. And so it's all about thinking about adult education, continuing development, thinking about helping people understand transitions in their career, and actually having maybe a mini retirement, a year off, a year traveling. These things that we're seeing a lot more now. That's kind of a natural expansion of us living longer. So we have this dynamic of people changing, but we also hear a lot about robots, about jobs changing, about this thing of digitalization. I'm sure a lot of people around the room here today are going through some sort of digitalization strategy. Now, if we think about that, we see that a lot of the executives tell us it's a number one priority for us. We're turning digital, but hey, we don't have the skills in our organizations to do that. So when we look at our own research, this piece on the left, we see that about 4/5 of organizations, 80% of organizations are going through some sort of digital transformation. What's interesting is that when we look at research from the World Economic Forum, they actually say that robots are coming, but robots are actually going to create more jobs. So you have this interesting dynamic of low unemployment in the United States, robots creating more jobs, and actually CEOs saying that they don't have the talent that they need in their organizations. So we know that people are changing, we know that jobs are changing. And we also know that industries are changing. This is a really interesting slide which looks at how long did it take different industries to reach 50 million users? So if we think historically about airplanes, it took us about 68 years to get to 50 million passengers. Automobiles a lot less, televisions, telephones. But what I find really interesting is if you think about Facebook. So if you think about Facebook, and we all think about Facebook as a technology company, as a company that lives online, it actually took them 3 years to reach 50 million users. And we compare that with Pokemon Go, which was launched in 2016, took them 19 days. So even that shift between thinking about Facebook and thinking about Pokemon, that's a big, big shift. But what that tells us as well is that businesses are changing in the speed of which they go to market. And this piece around digital is really important because it's not just about my own business, but it's also about how I reach my customers. Another couple of examples which I think are quite helpful to think about specific case studies. So Netflix, we all know Netflix. Netflix started as a video rental company. You used to mail your VCRs, video cassettes. I've forgotten what they are. And then they shifted to online, of course, curating content. But actually, 44% of their revenue now goes towards creating their own content. So that's a huge shift in their business model. And if you think about the people working for Netflix, who would have started off maybe thinking about logistics or operations, turned into maybe IT, now it's actually like a Hollywood studio that's creating its own content. So the jobs there completely shifted. A couple of other examples, a tobacco company, Philip Morris, Altria in the United States, they've actually said that they want 40% of their products to be smoke-free. So again, think about that, a business that's been around for 100 years that's suddenly saying, we actually don't want to be in the industry that we're in. We're going to go towards alternative smoking devices. And the third example there is BlackRock. Again, investment bank, but actually now turning into a tech company. 20% of their revenue comes from a platform they call Aladdin, which is AI stock picking. So basically, it's a platform they've developed using the investment bankers and tech teams, which they're now on-selling to other investment banks. So as we think about these shifts, and we think about what organizations are going to be doing, and we've tried to piece this together, we have to kind of think about it from a couple of different perspectives. One, jobs are going to change drastically, and the competencies within jobs are going to continue to change. Two, it's no longer a 5-year, 10-year plan that our businesses are going to have. Our businesses are going to be shifting really, really quickly. And so we want people to be able to adapt and shift to those changes. The panel talked a little bit around reward and incentive, and we definitely see that. So people will change jobs, not just because they're a good or bad fit for the job, but they also think about the broader culture and the broader environment that they're in. So with this in mind, what we tend to see is that organizations are going through, the organizations that we partner with are going through a rethink of their strategy when it comes to talent. And they think about it in really one of four ways. Do we go out and buy talent that helps us deliver our strategy? Do we rent talent? In other words, do we leverage the gig economy, things like Upwork, get people in for specific projects, and that's the way that we scale up? Do we grow people? So do we focus on our own internal people, focus on reskilling them, or do we automate? And do we go down the path of taking processes and automating them? There's a really interesting piece that I was reading from Adobe, the tech company. They were saying that the half-life of a skill is 5 years now. So a professional skill is only really good for about 5 years. So this kind of dynamic of thinking about buy, rent, grow, or automate is something that's going to be continuously shaping the way that organizations think about talent. So the way that we think about it is really starting with thinking about a model for potential and really understanding what are the characteristics that will help people be successful regardless of how your strategy might change or how jobs might change. And then when we think about jobs, we shift our focus to think about them not as a specific role, but as something called a job neighborhood, which is really thinking about the collection of skills you're able to have to be able to navigate a certain function within the organization. When we work with organizations, we start to baseline a lot of that. So we look at assessing what are the core profiles that people have and how can they fit into this future strategy. Now, a lot of organizations would have a lot of data on individuals, performance ratings. If you work in HR, I'm sure you have different records that you keep on people. So that could all be a helpful starting point to think about your talent. And so all of this data comes together to help us think about a strategy to either buy, rent, or grow organizations, talent within organizations. I wanted to share a little bit more about that model that we've developed, which is really helping us think about the future orientation of talent. And it's a competency. So are people familiar with competency models? Do people have them in their organizations? A few. Okay. So if you think about competencies, these are basically descriptions of knowledge, skills, abilities, behaviors that people can have that tend to be quite generic in some ways because they capture people across different functions and different jobs. And we studied about 3,000 data points to see who's becoming more successful in a digital environment. And 3 things came out: learnability, agility, and curiosity. Learnability is about seeking continuous improvement and really focusing on yourself, not just kind of technical skills, if you like. Agility, which is really about being flexible and adapting to different situations, and curiosity, which is being open and curious and having really a thirst for knowledge again. And the way that we combine this is really thinking about these competencies as the core that an individual needs to have to be able to grow in a digital environment. So helping us understand what those characteristics are, and then we supplement that with some additional competencies to help us understand how they might operate in a digital environment. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So one of the ones there is about mental endurance. If you've heard the word grit in a work environment, it's about really overcoming obstacles. If you face a setback, you're able to bounce back. That's what mental endurance is about. So we really want to understand where people sit on that spectrum. Do they handle rejections? Are they able to navigate that? And that's one example. Another example is virtual collaboration. Are they able to be effective in an environment where, for example, they're not getting a lot of support face-to-face with people, they're working remotely, and that's obviously a competency that we think about in a digital environment. The reason I share this is this is a helpful guide for us to sort of think about talent as they grow within our organizations. And I mentioned an assessment. We do an assessment. Now, when you think about assessments in the digital environment, there's an assessment that's foolproof, that's been around for years. Google. But it's not quite that. So what we do is we focus on thinking about the deep-seated psychological traits that people have. So we use tools that help us measure personality and motives and map that onto those competencies that I shared with you to be able to help us navigate that journey. And one shift that we have, so I mean, psychometric assessments have been around for a long time, but one shift we're making through this journey is really putting the power back on the employee. So we often think about it from a learning and talent development perspective as, in the past, you would have given your teams and your employees and your talent learning and development options. What we want to do is to shift that focus, to actually empower people to think about it more as like a buffet. You go up and you choose what you want, and you pick up the development that you need. And that really is supported by this understanding of yourself at a much more deeper level. So I don't know if it's very clear actually on the slide, but this is an example of a job neighborhood. So the job neighborhood is marketing. Someone gets a fit score against that and then navigates all the potential roles within that kind of job family. Now, the question then comes up when we think about development of sort of where to focus and where to develop. And I share the example of my wife. She kind of went off and did something different, which leveraged some of her skills. But we see this kind of dynamic between breadth and depth. And this is an example, again, of someone that's in marketing. So the traditional focus for development has been all about depth, which is all around you get more skills to be able to do your job more effectively. What we're seeing is actually there's a big case to be made for actually being more general and picking up additional skills that might help you navigate in a digital world. So we talk about it quite often as a T-shaped development plan. So you're getting breadth and you're getting depth at the same time. The other thing that we see is that there's a lot of pressure on what robots are actually going to be replacing, what jobs are going to go away. And we sort of say that the ability of humans to provide context is something that's not going to go away. So if you think about, for example, a physician, maybe the diagnostic part of what they do is going to improve through AI, but actually the human element of sitting down across the table from someone and helping them come up with a treatment plan is not going to go away. And this is something to just supplement that. This is a piece of research that basically looked at zeroing in income at 1980 and using a database of jobs, looking at how jobs changed over time in terms of pay. And actually the biggest growth is jobs with a high social component. So we often think about professional skills, technical skills, engineers being invaluable in our environment today. They are. But actually what this tells us as well is things like leadership skills, ability to give feedback, ability to have a difficult conversation, ability to work with different people is also growing in terms of its importance in today's environment. So with that, I just wanted to conclude that this idea of careers is really shifting really rapidly, and our intention is really to help people navigate from what traditionally used to be a very linear career. You go step by step through your career to something which is much more towards the right, which is more about open market. We quite often use the analogy of it's like rock climbing. You go up, you go down, you go sideways. The idea being that people will navigate their careers with options that suit them the best through the open market, and we're really seeing a rapid shift towards that side. With that, I'll pause. I think we've got a couple of minutes, so I can take one or two questions, and there's a couple of questions there.
Thank you. Yeah. How do you define the competencies for, I think you called them the job, what are they called? Job neighborhood. Like, who's deciding the competencies for marketing?
Right, so this piece here.
Yeah.
So really it's about almost reverse engineering what you might have or what you might think is needed for the future. So quite often we actually find that some of the ways that we've traditionally done things like job analysis still hold, but you just have to shift your focus to thinking about future jobs and thinking about, okay, it's not about specific skill or competency or a particular technical area, but it's more about what is used to navigate those areas, if you know what I mean.
I don't. I actually really want to get our organization to look at all of their jobs this way. So I guess I'm trying to understand how to build the consensus of what the job neighborhood looks like.
So in terms of consensus, so we would do things like focus groups, so SME meetings, we would do things like benchmarking specific jobs, and it's actually easy because there are a lot of free resources now that are available online, things like Own It, that can help you really understand. So a lot of this is actually built on Own It. So if you go to Own It, you'll see the kind of some of the future jobs, and you can kind of map back some of those skills and competencies that might be needed.
And then, do you think StrengthsFinders is a good tool for figuring out the strengths of the employee?
So, look, I think you just need to take a holistic view of both the person and the competency. So, StrengthsFinders, other tools are out there that kind of serve that purpose, but I think really it's about understanding, do you get good coverage against the competencies that you want to assess? do one more question here.
Hi. So I spend a lot of time talking to leaders about, I myself have been a job changer. I've had a multitude of different, and I tell everyone at every job, I can do this. And they're like, I don't know. And, you know, so I've experienced it as an employee, but as a leader, it is my job to get executives to think differently, especially if they're bringing in more diverse candidates, right? So this is a big question, so answer however you think you can. What I want to know is, how do I get them to understand this? But I know that's like a long, you know, that deserves a 3-hour presentation, I'm sure. But like, what are a couple examples or questions I can ask that can get them thinking differently? And I'll just give you an example. I try to find someone in their org who works for them that had a non-traditional path, right? To use them as an example, to say, well, you know, Bob on your team, you know, was a truck driver before this, and now look at him, right? So any advice that you could give on that in terms of because leaders are good at their SME and what they do, but it's often hard for them to think outside of that box that they're kind of in.
Look, it's a complicated one, because I think quite often we find with leaders that that no one wants to start first. They want to see someone else do it first and then kind of leverage that. So, I mean, the most successful approaches that we've seen is where people start really small, organizations start really small, and they start with a part of the business or a team that's a quick win. And then that almost becomes a flag for the rest of the organization. Hey, it's worked in this department. Let's try it in your department. So a couple of the examples I've shared actually started really, really small. So it was, you know, a 100-person group of people in one location that wanted to try this. And through that, you know, it starts to resonate. So not maybe a direct kind of answer to your question, but I would say think about piloting and starting small, where you can get a bit of a quick win. So I know the time is up and I'm between you and coffee, so thank you very much. I'll be around. And thank you very much for today.